This is hell.
There's an ongoing debate on whether climate change can be addressed at the same time as the capitalism that caused it. Can we deal with both at the same time? While our first guest this week believes both can be done with ecosocialism, she also warns us about leftist policies that are funded by climate change causing extractive resources. Here to talk ecosocialism and extractivism, political scientist Thea Riofrancos wrote the In These Times article, A Plan to Democratic Socialism Means a Path to Climate Justice. And she also posted the Dissent magazine article, What Comes After Extractivism. Welcome to This Is Hell, Thea.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
You can read her writing at inthesetimes.com as well as at dissentmagazine.org. And you can find all of her work at TheaRiofrancos.com. Follow Thea on Twitter at @TRiofrancos. Your article at In These Times a couple weeks ago, A Path to Democratic Socialism Means a Path to Climate Justice, was actually a response to another article at In These Times by Tabitha Chow called We Don't Have Time to End Capitalism, but Growth Can Still Be Green. The article by Tabitha is subheadlined with the descriptor, Growth, energy use, and emissions are historically linked, but this trend could end with mass investment in renewables and energy efficiency. And you write in your responding story, while the question of whether we should address capitalism first or climate change first is often posed in sequential terms, it's a false choice, though a compelling one. Why is addressing climate change first or capitalism first a false choice?
So it is a false choice because I think that as social movements and also some of our kind of allied insurgent elected members of Congress and at the sort of city and state level as well, are focusing on policies that can address both social, economic inequality and forms of domination and exploitation at the same time that they address climate emissions. And I want to address really briefly why I think it's a compelling one. In the next 10 years that we have to seriously change our energy systems, our kind of entire ways of life and built environment in order to avoid further climate crisis, it seems quite compelling to argue that it's not possible to undo an entire model of accumulation that's been built over hundreds of years and is deeply entrenched across the globe. But I think what's important is not to view the matter as ending capitalism before we address climate crisis, but rather finding ways, and there are many ways, to address climate crisis that also begin to chip away at some of the core pillars of capitalism, whether that's private property or profit or privatized forms of consumption. And so thinking about demands that social movements can make and then some of the policies that those demands might inspire that chip away both at socioeconomic inequality and address mitigating and creating more resiliency around the climate crisis that's already unfolding and has been unfolding for a while now.
We recently spoke with sustainability scholar Jem Bendell, and he was saying that sustainability is not sustainable and that we need to go to the next step, which is deep adaptation. Are you talking, can capitalism adapt to climate change? Is that what you're talking about when you're saying that it is compelling that we can adapt capitalism to climate change?
Well, I think that the green capitalists and the clean tech industry, which is now like a hundreds of $billion industry that's investing in quote unquote clean fuels and clean technology, green technology, does think that that's possible. And I think that certainly forms of investment can take place, within capitalism that begin to transition societies to low or no carbon energy. I think that's not only possible, but it's already happening. So to argue otherwise would be unempirical. But those forms of transition, I agree, are not ultimately sustainable because just swapping out one energy source for another doesn't address the fact that capitalism as a system externalizes environmental and social costs and never sort of pays the bill and is always going to kind of expand more than is doable within planetary limits. So I think that while you can change the energy sources and you can potentially lower emissions while not touching the capitalist model of accumulation, capitalism itself cannot be sustainable, at least not in the form that, we've known it to exist over the past hundreds of years, which is why I'm suggesting that instead of sort of thinking about how to adapt capitalism, we should think about reforms and that are transformative in some way, that come out of longstanding social movement, environmental, ecological, and social justice movement demands that also get at some of the most oppressive aspects of capitalism. So let me give some examples to make this a little bit more concrete. There are demands around the country for better mass transit systems. There are demands around the country for addressing the exorbitant cost of housing, which is now one of the primary causes of sort of the decline in working class, kind of material well-being, is both stagnating wages but also extremely high costs of rent. There are demands popping up that are very interesting for public, democratic, and community control over utilities, over the grid, right? So each of these, if we actually had mass transit, if we actually had a system of zero carbon social housing, if we actually had democratically controlled, decarbonized grids and utilities, we would be doing two things at once. We would be addressing some of the deep forms of exploitation and oppression that occur under capitalism that deny people the sort of means of their own existence in housing and transit and other such things. And we would also be moving towards a more sustainable society that's not just about switching out the energy source. So I don't think that's, a small task or unimportant, but it's also about, for example, in the case of transit and housing, collectivizing and socializing the way that we consume, because one of the aspects of capitalism, especially in its sort of like American post-war mass consumption guise, is the fact that we all consume privately, and we also consume things that are manufactured to be obsolete, right? So we're consuming individually, and we're consuming as much as the market will sell us. So I think that transitioning to social and collective forms of consumption is a much more rational use of resources, right? So an electric bus is a better use of resources than all of us owning individual Teslas. So what I'm getting at in these times piece is thinking about demands that simultaneously demand a different form of energy and decarbonization, but also think about reorganizing the way that we relate to one another in ways that little by little, though hopefully, rapidly enough to address the climate crisis, actually change our social relationships, actually change the way that we produce, consume, and work, as well as changing the energy source.
And just to reinforce what you said, I want to quote your article where you say, this is not to say that an eco-socialist strategy has no political tensions or challenges. There will necessarily be changes in habits of consumption, habits that are by no means confined to the affluent. We need to catalyze a change in social values wherein communal activities such as recreational sports, dancing, art projects, and book clubs, as well as forms of collective consumption, not only of transit and housing, but of food, theater, film, and much more, become valorized. So will the biggest change be a societal change, be one where we collectively are working together more, are connected more? Will we have less time to ourselves as we will be dedicating more time to everyone else? Because the thing that I'm concerned about is, just like you heard these claims by conservatives that climate change was a socialist plot, I'm afraid that within this, they'll see this is a plot against the individual. So how difficult will it be to have that societal change going from one that is so individual-oriented to one that's collectively oriented?
I like that a lot. I think it is a plot against the individual, at least the individual defined as a sort of property-owning consumer, right, as we sort of defined it, especially in the post-war period to the present in the United States. I want to reiterate, though, and the quote that you read, I think hopefully makes this clear, that my sort of vision of an eco-socialist utopia, right, the thing that sort of gets me up in the morning when I think about what is the society that I'm fighting for, is a profoundly pleasurable society, right? It's a society of more time to socialize, of more time to engage in those activities that you just listed, of learning and dancing and eating together. And these are the types of activities that already give me pleasure when I have time to engage in them in our existing society. But an eco-socialist low carbon society would involve more forms of time spent with meaningful social relations rather than consuming junk that doesn't actually make us happy, right? So I think that's a key point to point out. And there's a recent article out in The Intercept by Kate Aronoff about how a Green New Deal might make us happier, right? So I think that a plot against the individual, again, as defined as a sort of overworked, over-consuming individual that really is not happy at the end of the day. I mean, we even have a crisis in the U.S. with forms of addiction, with increasing suicide rates. I mean, I don't think that anyone could argue that the masses of working class people in the U.S. are happy with their existence. So I think that now is a moment to kind of rethink what we value and think about ways that a society that values more time together and more pleasurable activities would also be a society that is better for the environment.
You're right. We need to ensure that redistribution and the public provisioning of goods and services like transit and healthcare would offset the increased costs of some consumer items. So is that the hardest message to convey to people who are skeptical about the near-term impact of climate change? That is, convincing them that public provisioning of goods and services like transit and healthcare would offset any increased costs, including taxes. Is the most difficult thing to change people's minds on taxes and public funding will be offset by lower costs?
Well, so yeah, I think that there's a couple of things kind of in terms of the economics of this that I'm getting at in this sentence and that you're also bringing up. Some interesting new survey data by the Center for Data Progress, I think they're called, shows surprisingly to me that Americans that they surveyed actually are in favor of increasing taxes on the wealthy, not on everybody, but on the wealthy, on the ultra-rich, in order to fund a Green New Deal. And that in and of itself, it might not surprise some on the left that people would support that, but I think that we both know that there's a very deep anti-tax sentiment in the U.S., and even when you ask people and make it clear that it's taxes on that wouldn't affect them, that would affect the better off, people still are hesitant to support tax increases. But this interesting new data shows that there's growing support for tax increases to fund a Green New Deal, so long as those tax increases are progressive in nature and affect, the 1% or however you want to frame it. So I think that attitudes on that are shifting a bit in interesting ways that a left-wing kind of project around the Green New Deal could further kind of shift that social opinion. So that's one set of things. Another set of things is what I'm talking about in this sentence, which is that, right now we in the U.S. and we in many places in the world are kind of used to artificially cheap forms of consumption, right? The fact that, buying a new cell phone every year or eating red meat that is super cheap, especially if you get it at a fast food place, that feels cheap to us, but there's a whole system that makes that artificially cheap, right? Some of that has to do with the fact that corporations don't ever pay the full bill for social and environmental costs of, for example, the factory farm system. Some of that also has to do with the fact that our own tax dollars and government subsidize industrial agriculture and make it artificially cheap. So there's a whole set of processes that make our consumption artificially cheap and allow us to consume even as wages are stagnating. So there's a tricky set of public policy changes that need to both, on the one hand, force corporations to pay the full cost of their environmental and social harms, and also regulate those industries much more so there are fewer social and environmental harms. But then the issue comes up immediately of people who don't make very much money and are used to sort of being able to buy some of these things with their income, and how those prices might increase for food or for other consumer goods whose prices would increase if corporations actually sort of embedded the full cost of their environmental and social impacts into the price. So in order to offset that, I think we need to think as much as possible about what some scholars call the social wage, like that is and what we might call in the U.S. kind of welfare or public provision. So thinking about ways that individuals with higher taxes on the wealthy, we could fund things like mass transit, like social housing, so that each individual wasn't paying so much of their individual income for things that ensure their basic social reproduction, like their home and their transit to work and those sorts of things. So if we were, as a society, if each individual was paying less of that because that was socialized, then people could afford to pay a little bit more for some consumer goods and food and things like that, and those consumer goods could reflect more the real social environmental cost of their production.
We are speaking with political scientist Thea Riofrancos. She wrote the In These Times article, A Path to Democratic Socialism Means a Path to Climate Justice, which you can find at inthisetimes.com. She also posted the Dissent magazine article, What Comes After Extractivism, which you can find at dissentmagazine.org. Thea's upcoming book is called Resource Radicals, From Petro-Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador, and she is on the steering committee of the Democratic Socialists of America, Ecosocialists. You can find out more about Thea at TheaRiofrancos.com. You mentioned built-in obsolescence earlier. You write, we must eat less red meat and devalue the consumption of plastic junk and latest model cell phones and other tech that not only contribute to social alienation, but are tremendously destructive to the planet. Manufactured for obsolescence, shipped across great distances in carbon-spewing ships and trucks, and relying on neo-colonial patterns of cheapened nature and labor in the global South. To you, what does planned, built-in obsolescence, what does that reveal to you about the nature or maybe the state of capitalism today?
Well, I think it kind of picks up on some of the points that I was making before, that the kind of definition of the individual as a consumer and the fact that we are constantly being marketed sort of the next model, and that our very deep identities and affects and sort of ways of being in the world are structured around consuming the latest model cell phone or the latest model computer or clothing. And, fashion is also part of this. I don't mention this in the article, but the extremely cheap, artificially cheap, for all of the reasons that I just said, because the corporations never pay the full social and environmental costs of the production of this fashion, and including the extremely cheapened labor that is primarily in the global South, but also in the U.S. That is the sort of enabling conditions for this extremely cheap consumption. And in this process, we have lost. I don't want to say this in a nostalgic way, because my goal is not to return to the past, but I just want to note that we have lost kind of basic relationships and forms of control over the objects in our lives. I have a cell phone. I have no idea how to repair it if something went wrong with it. I wouldn't even know, in the U.S. at least, where to take it to repair it if the battery stopped working, or if basically we are told that if our thing breaks, we are to buy a new one, right? This is not exactly the case everywhere in the world. I think that there are places that still have, this. I spent a lot of time in South America researching extractivism, which we'll get to next, and there are many more forms of repair shops around that still exist for electronics, but there are fewer and fewer of those types of electronic repair shops in the U.S., partly because the phones and our iPads and tablets and all sorts of things are designed to be very difficult to repair, and they're designed that way on purpose in order to encourage people to buy new objects rather than repairing the ones that we have. And there's an interesting kind of, maybe movement is too strong a word, but there's an interesting kind of environmental and kind of ecological sustainability term that is called the right to repair. And the right to repair just kind of forces us to think about, why do we have no control or relationship or kind of sense of care about the objects that we have? We throw them out as soon as they kind of falter a little bit and buy something new that might be doable for us because of the artificial cheapness of consumer goods, but is contributing to just mountains and mountains of discarded junk that is not being properly recycled, and is not being reused, and is just contributing to global warming in a million ways. I'll just note that right now I'm studying lithium extraction in South America. Lithium is a key element that goes into all of our rechargeable batteries, whether cell phones or Teslas, anything that recharges. And lithium will be a key extractive frontier in the renewable transition, because the more and more we electrify transit, the more we'll need batteries. There's a bunch that I could go into with some of the ecological and social impacts of lithium mining. But for now, I'll just say that, we could be building infrastructures to recycle batteries so that with the coming renewable transition, we don't just throw out these batteries as soon as they're not working perfectly or holding a charge for as long as we would like, and we reuse them for some other application, which can certainly be done. And there's a lot of interesting research on battery recycling. But right now, aside from China, most countries in the world don't really have battery recycling infrastructures, which will, as you can imagine, create a huge amount of waste once we fully transition to, for example, electrified transit.
And while you are writing about ecosocialism, I think this is a good segue into extractivism. You write that a neoliberal climate policy without social justice at the center is a political dead end. Why is climate policy without social justice at its center a political dead end?
Well, I think that we saw this with the ongoing Yellow Vest movement, which is continuing to protest what was originally a tax increase on fuel in France, but has become a broader movement than just that. But I think that we see that when policymakers implement policies like a carbon price or carbon tax or fuel tax with, some to some extent, the good intentions of incentivizing people to shift away from high carbon towards lower zero carbon forms of energy, when they do that without taking into account the unequal societies that already exist, and therefore the fact that those costs will be borne unequally unless they are intentionally designed to mitigate that inequality, then people will riot, people will protest, and for good reason, because the working class and economically precarious of the world is struggling to meet their sort of day-to-day needs. And so something like a carbon price or a carbon tax, again, without sort of taking into account inequality, and without mitigating that inequality in the design of the policy, is going to elicit protest, or it's just not going to work. It's not going to pass as a policy. So I think that, thinking about ways, which is I think the sort of genius of the Green New Deal. Not that I don't have some critiques of the current proposals contained in the Green New Deal vision, but I think the genius and the most important part of the Green New Deal is the way that it explicitly connects climate crisis and climate change to social and economic inequality, which I want to note is not like an invention of the Green New Deal. Climate justice and environmental justice movements for decades have been saying that inequality and climate change are inextricably linked to one another. The reasons for that are twofold. On the one hand, the most affluent within the U.S. and in the world, both people and kind of entire countries, the most affluent emit the most carbon. Their lifestyles are the most carbon intensive. They consume the most. I mean, they have the most swimming pools. They have the most cars. It's kind of obvious once you start to think about it, but it's an extremely tight correlation. On the other hand, another extremely tight correlation is that those who consume the least and who have contributed the least to global emissions are the most vulnerable to climate change for other reasons that are also, I think, rather obvious once you start to think about it. So there's a deep relationship between inequality and climate change. And I think that kind of insight also has its sort of like political strategic corollary, which is that we need to address both of these at the same time in our social movement demands and also in our public policies. We cannot separate them out because they are inextricably linked. And when we try to separate them out, we get, I think, reasonable forms of protest and rioting and disaffection among the public, who feels that they are being burdened by a problem that they did not individually create. And if they're not well off, they contributed basically nothing to this problem.
So let's go from a process that actually addresses capitalism and climate change, ecosocialism, to a way that only addresses capitalism, and that's extractivism. In your article at Dissent magazine, What Comes After Extractivism, you start by writing on December 14th, 2016, leftist President Rafael Correa declared a state of emergency in the province of Morona, Santiago, in the Amazonian region of Ecuador, deploying hundreds of troops and nationalist police. This marked the culmination of years of clashes at the site of an open-pit copper mine in the area of San Carlos, which indigenous Shuar people had occupied in protest against the expansion of mining and the threat posed to their territory and livelihoods. So local indigenous people were protesting mine expansion that would threaten their homes and lives. What explains why a leftist president would send in the troops? And was this action by Correa a surprise to his supporters or unpopular?
So it was not a surprise. I don't know if it was a surprise to his sort of like base of supporters that were very loyal to him, but it wasn't a surprise more broadly because Correa had been involved for years. Correa came to power in 2007. My first experience living in Ecuador was the year after that, and so I kind of throughout my time in Ecuador observed this process unfold. He was in power for 10 years, totally democratically. He won multiple elections. So from 2007 to 2017, Rafael Correa was in power along with many other left-wing governments throughout the region, which is called the pink tide. And it's called that because they weren't, kind of like state socialists, or they weren't revolutionary. So it's not the red tide, but it's the pink tide. They were moving policies in a leftward direction. So during that time, especially in Ecuador, but also in Bolivia, also to an extent in Venezuela and Brazil and some of the other countries that currently have or did have left-wing governments, there erupted conflicts between indigenous and environmental movements and the left in power over the question of what's called the extractive model of development. And so this was not a surprise. This was sort of the culmination and one of the most intense instances, because the military was there and there was a state of emergency for 3 months, and the Shuar indigenous people had reoccupied land that had become a mining camp. And so it was, a particularly contentious and violent and intense moment of conflict. But it was by no means the first one there. I personally participated and observed a 2-week-long march that went from the Amazon all the way to Quito, 700 kilometers. That was sparked by anti-mining protests, and though it also ended up involving other demands as well. But there was ongoing protest during the Correa administration over this. And why? I'll just sort of lay out a little bit the kind of broader the kind of broader conjuncture. On the one hand, the left was coming to power across Latin America, and Ecuador was one example of that, and that's referred to as the pink tide, as I just mentioned. That started with Chavez coming to power in 1999, and you have, for a decade and a half, you have left governments sort of ruling over much of the region. At its height, I think in 2009 or 10, left-wing governments, 2/3 of the region's population lived under left of center or pretty left-wing governments, right? So that's a historic change. For anyone familiar with the history of Latin America, you have in the 70s and 80s these brutal right-wing dictatorships. In the 80s through the early 2000s, in many parts of the region, you have neoliberal governments. So it's right in like 2000 where this tide is turning to the left, because people are just fed up with neoliberal policies that are not serving them. So a lot of left-wing governments are elected. Interestingly, in total historical coincidence, at the same time, you have the beginning of what people refer to as the commodity boom. So that is literally at the same time, from around 2000 to around 2014, it ends abruptly with the fall in the price of oil. But for a decade and a half, you have sustained high prices for commodities like soy, gas, gold, copper, oil, all of these primary commodities that all also happen to be Latin America's primary exports. So in a way, this is like a win-win situation. I'm going to put the environment and climate and indigenous rights to the side for just a moment to explain some of the positives that positive opportunities that this opened up for the left in power, and then I'll get into the problems with it. So on the one hand, you have this positive situation. Left-wing governments come to power with tremendous popular support and very broad popular mandates, and they have the fiscal resources. They have the taxes and royalties and rents that come from all of these extractive sectors and these agribusiness sectors that are flooding their treasuries with money, and they have the money to spend on social services, on public infrastructure, on all sorts of things that affect people's material well-being in a very direct way. So they're able to sort of make good on their economic justice promises to pull the poor out of poverty, to reduce inequality, to address longstanding issues of joblessness, of sanitation, of education, all sorts of things. And you see really dramatic changes that even sort of like institutions that we wouldn't expect, like the World Bank, like speak positively of, because so many people were pulled out of poverty by public policies that use these resource rents, that use this income from resource extraction in order to benefit the majority of the population. And one more thing before getting into some of the deep negatives, the deep problems with this model that I want to note is that it wasn't just the invention of these left governments, right? And so I don't like to start the story of the pink tide, even though I kind of just did, with these governments coming to power, because before they came to power, there was a decade of social mobilization across the region protesting neoliberal policies. And one of the demands, and these demands were really salient in countries like Ecuador, Bolivia, Venezuela, countries that are dependent on these primary commodities, the demand was these resources have long served foreign capitalists. It's time for them to serve us. It's time to actually redistribute and democratize and have public ownership and state ownership and over these resources so that we can actually benefit from them. Now, full expropriation didn't happen in most cases, but the left governments did, to an extent, respond to those demands by, instead of using resource rents to sort of benefit or profit foreign corporations, they started to use them to actually fund social services. So I want to note that this was social movement demand initially. But what happened was that as this model got intensified, and especially as we move into more and more really environmentally damaging forms of extraction, and I'm thinking particularly of large-scale mining, which, as we know from the U.S. history of and present of mining, removes mountaintops, it moves entire communities, it pollutes water systems. There's no such thing as sustainable or responsible mining. That's kind of a corporate discourse. Mining always pollutes. It's just an extremely intensive extractive process. So as it became clear, especially to the local communities, oftentimes indigenous, but also campesino or small farmer, mestizo, not only indigenous, but often indigenous communities, what the social and environmental costs of this sort of economic boom and this kind of redistributive boom were, they began to protest. And this started little by little to become a wedge between some of the very communities and movements that had supported the rise of the left and that had opened up the possibility through their protest against prior neoliberal governments. They began to protest the left. And in several cases, but Ecuador is, I think, a particularly good example of this, it became very polarized very quickly. So Correa could have negotiated, or he could have said, let's slow down this extractive process, or let's think how to do it, with more respect for indigenous rights and actually consulting indigenous communities, as is, the international norm and national law in Ecuador, and think about how to do this in a way that is less harmful, less rapid. I mean, just like the pace of extraction became very rapid. But that didn't happen. It got very polarized. So on the one hand, you had a leftist government with a real wide base of support because many poor and working class Ecuadorians really directly benefited from his policies. But then there were many that didn't, in the sense of the communities that already, because of being indigenous and being rural and peripheral, already faced other forms of marginalization, just now had like a new thing to contend with, which was the expansion of large-scale mining. So this became a real wedge within the left, among movements, among what we call the popular sectors of the marginalized and exploited and excluded in Ecuador. This became a wedge that divided some of those that did benefit, at least during the boom. But again, those benefits end very dramatically once the boom ends, and those that were bearing some of the immediate social and environmental costs. Though, of course, there are broader planetary environmental costs because resource extraction as a model of development also contributes to climate change through deforestation and building roads to export and extract primary commodities. So it has planetary effects, but the immediate environmental forms of contamination are what get people to mobilize.
Do leftist governments like the one in Ecuador, do they have a choice in the way that they can fund their leftist projects? How dependent are Latin American economies on extraction? And I don't want to ask you too many questions in one question, but my follow-up was going to be, and why? Does that say something about the colonial relationship?
It absolutely does. I'm going to start with the last question first, and then I'll come back to the fiscal model, or to the model of sort of replacing resource rents with something else. It absolutely is rooted in colonialism. I teach Latin American politics, and sort of our first week or two of classes is on the sort of initial colonial encounter, and that is when this model of rapacious resource extraction first to fund the Spanish Empire, but it doesn't get dramatically changed at all by governments after the independence from the Spanish Empire. Kind of stays in place, and it gets, at some moments in Latin American history, there are interesting attempts to kind of change this model. So in the mid-20th century, you have attempts to kind of shift away from primary resource extraction towards more industrialization, and that works to some extent in some places. I think Brazil stands out, Argentina maybe after Brazil, in terms of countries that were able to build to some extent an industrial base that has its own environmental costs. I don't want to downplay that, but is less immediately dependent on the extraction of resources. But that is to some extent a short-lived moment of what's called sort of developmentalism or kind of state-led industrialization. And then we have those brutal right-wing dictatorships that I mentioned, and then we have neoliberalism. And it's during the neoliberal moment that the resource extraction sectors are deregulated and that foreign investment is courted. And that's when the model of resource extraction, which has hundreds of years in history, going back to the silver mines of Potosí, which funded the Spanish Empire, gets really re-entrenched again. So So it has a longer durée history, but there are sort of conjunctural changes, and as of the neoliberal period, we're in a moment of reentrenchment, which unfortunately, while the left was in power, got further deepened because of the very high prices for commodities. It's understandable that it was hard to resist sort of funding social programs, which again were part of their mandate to come to power, with these commodities that had like extraordinarily unusually high prices. So what could have the left done differently? And I want to note that it wasn't like no one tried to do anything different. In fact, Correa himself, and I think he doesn't get enough attention for this among those who are critical of his extractivist policies, he did actually implement some changes to the tax code that made the tax system more progressive, and that specifically taxed forms of wealth and capital of the very rich in Ecuador, and that also tried to close some of the issues with tax loopholes that allowed for sort of evasion of taxes. And this is just, it is, we were talking earlier about taxes in the U.S. and people's anti-tax attitudes. This is a big deal in South America as well, and even more so because the states are sort of historically weak and have low institutional capacity in terms of actually collecting taxes, and the rich have never wanted to pay taxes in South America. And this actually is another thing that dates even to the early independence era that I was just mentioning. So you have a longstanding issue with a lack of a sustainable fiscal base, meaning a lack of a sort of income for the state that comes from property and income taxes, which is more sustainable because you know how much property there is, you know how much you tax it, you know how much you're going to get each year. Where if your fiscal base is based on the export of primary commodities, each year they might have a different price. They're very volatile. That decade and a half of high prices was very unusual, and since then we've been back to a more normal sort of price volatility for primary commodities. So the trick is to make the sort of income of the state more dependent on taxing the rich. And these are extremely unequal societies, right? So that would also have another benefit, which is making those societies less unequal and reducing some of the political power of the rich by taking some of their wealth away, right? So making the basis of the state or the fiscal basis of the state more based on taxes and rather than based on commodity exports. And that is extremely difficult, just the sort of bureaucratic task of building up state capacity to actually tax the wealthy and make sure that they don't evade it. But moving in that direction, even if it's through incremental policy reforms, is extremely important for having an actual pool of money that can be used to spend on the needs of the least well-off, but that doesn't further entrench extractivism.
We have been speaking with political scientist Thea Riofrancos. She wrote the In These Times article, A Path to Democratic Socialism Means a Path to Climate Justice, which you can find at InTheseTimes.com. She also posted the Dissent magazine article, What Comes After Extractivism. You can find that story at dissentmagazine.org. Thea, as we do with all of our guests, we have our final question for each and every one of our guests is what we call the question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, or our audience is going to hate your response. You write, when the left is in power, both governments and movements claim the mantle of representing the people and pursuing greater equality. As a result, the left is marked by a dilemma. From the position of governance, how do you occupy the state at the same time that you seek to transform it? How do you do that? How do you occupy the state at the same time that you seek to transform it? We've had recent guests suggest that by fixing capitalism, by reforming it, you're making an unfair system more powerful. Any reform or fix is a re-entrenchment of capitalism. You're actually enabling the system of oppression that you are fighting against. So to what extent can the state transform the state, no matter how far left the state is?
So I think that the best way to think about this question is to reframe it slightly. And I don't think the state can do anything on its own. I don't even think, with the best person in power, with the best party in power, and with the best intentions and the best policy plans, those might have some positive effect. But without a broader sort of ecosystem of social mobilization, of disruptive capacity, of collective power, of what we call the sort of 99% or the popular sectors or the sort of grassroots, without that form of social mobilization and social organization, there are many limitations to what the state, or a left political party or a leader can do on their own, because they will inevitably run up against the limitations of the power of investors, of the power of the ruling class, of the power of the powerful, right? So without having, even with good intentions, there are limitations, and sort of without having a grassroots movement that has some autonomy from the state, and this is important, has some critical sort of distance from the state and can pressure the state to be as radical as possible, but also can sort of defend left policy advances against the inevitable reaction of the ruling class. Without a sort of healthy ecosystem of organization from below, I don't actually think that even a very enlightened, leftist statesperson can accomplish very much on their own. So I agree that there are serious kind of pitfalls and limitations to thinking solely in terms of the state or government or legislative reform, but I don't think that makes those irrelevant. What I think is important is a difficult to achieve dynamic of popular kind of mobilization that has some autonomy from the state, that isn't co-opted or just like an arm of the state, that can therefore push the state to be more radical, can sort of keep the state accountable, right? I think about this all the time, like, what if Bernie were to come to power, right? And we don't know, but what if a left-wing president, whoever it was in the future, were to come to power in the U.S., right? I don't think that means that left movements are no longer necessary. I think that they become even more necessary to keep those politicians accountable and also to defend gains when they happen against the inevitable reaction of the ruling class. So I would reframe that question slightly and think more broadly in terms of state-society relations, more broadly in terms of forms of non-state disruptive political activity from below that is pushing the state and simultaneously defending left gains. And I think when we look back into history and look at experiences with the left in power, whether it's recently the pink tide in Latin America, whether it's Allende in Chile in the 1970s, whether it's Syriza in Greece, like whenever we see examples of the left in power, when that dynamic is missing, when we don't have social movements from below holding politicians accountable and also defending the gains that are made, we see that the left is weakened in the state. It's isolated and it's prone to being co-opted by the ruling class, or just being like totally limited by the ruling class, or worse, what happened to Allende, we see that coups and military interventions take place. So I think that dynamic of movements of the left, the sort of left in resistance and the left in power is really key to understanding how left projects can be sustainable and transformative over time.
Thea, thank you so much for being on the show, and we'd love to have you back on when your new book comes out, Resource Radicals, From Petro-Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador. So anticipate us annoying you in emails in the very near future.
I'd be happy to. Thank you.
That's political scientist Thea Riofrancos. She wrote the In These Times article, A Path to Democratic Socialism Means a Path to Climate Justice, and the Dissent magazine article, What Comes After Extractivism. You can find all of her work at TheaRiofrancos.com.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.